In 1667, the Dutch Republic sat down with England to end a brutal war. On the table was a tiny island in Indonesia, roughly 3 miles long, covered in trees that produced a single spice. The Dutch wanted that island so badly they were willing to give up something else entirely, a muddy little trading post on the other side of the world called Manhattan. They took the island. England took Manhattan. That is how much the world once valued a spice most of us barely think about today: nutmeg. This is the story of how black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg did not just flavor food. They funded empires. They started wars. They accidentally led to the discovery of an entire continent. This is the secret history of spices, a story of war, wealth, and world discovery. Before we get to the wars and the fortunes, it is worth asking a basic question. Why did people care this much about spices in the first place? For most of human history, before refrigeration, before modern medicine, spices did 3 things that made them worth more than gold, ounce for ounce, in some periods of history. The first was preservation and masking. Salted meat that had begun to turn did not taste pleasant. Strong spices like pepper and cloves could cover unpleasant flavors, and some of them, we now know, had mild antimicrobial properties that genuinely slowed spoilage. In a world without refrigeration, that was not a luxury. It was closer to a necessity for anyone who could afford it. The second was medicine. In the ancient and medieval world, there was no clean separation between a spice and a medicine. Cinnamon, pepper, ginger, and cloves appear constantly in ancient medical writing, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Chinese, and Indian alike, as treatments for digestive trouble, infections, toothaches, and in some desperate cases, the plague. A merchant selling pepper was, in a real sense, also selling medicine. The third reason, and maybe the most powerful one, was status. A wealthy Roman sprinkling pepper over his food was not simply seasoning a meal. He was showing every guest at his table that he could afford something that had traveled thousands of miles, through the hands of a dozen different traders, just to reach his plate. Spices were edible proof of wealth. And here is the detail that made all of this so explosive. Almost none of these spices grew anywhere near Europe. Black pepper came from the Malabar coast of southern India. Fine cinnamon came from the island of Sri Lanka, a place the Greeks and Romans knew mostly through rumor and second-hand stories. Cloves and nutmeg were even more extreme. They grew on a tiny cluster of islands in what is now Indonesia, the Banda Islands and the nearby Moluccas, sometimes nicknamed the Spice Islands. At one point in history, nutmeg trees existed on Earth in exactly one place. A small group of about 10 islands you could walk across in a single day. So every peppercorn, every stick of cinnamon, every clove that reached a European table had already traveled further than most people alive at that time would travel in their entire lives. And every one of those miles was controlled by someone who had absolutely no intention of letting Europe learn where these spices actually came from. That secrecy is where our story truly begins. For roughly 2,000 years, spices moved from Asia to Europe along a sprawling network we now casually call the Silk Road. Those spices, far more often than silk, were the cargo that made the whole system worth the risk. The route worked like an extremely long, extremely expensive game of telephone. Spices grown in India, Sri Lanka, and the Indonesian islands were first bought by local and Malay traders. They sold them to Indian merchants. Those merchants sold them to Arab traders working out of ports like Aden and Hormuz. Arab traders carried them overland or by sea to cities like Alexandria or Constantinople, where Venetian and Genoese merchants bought them and shipped them across the Mediterranean into the rest of Europe. By the time a single sack of pepper reached a market stall in Venice, it may have changed hands 10 or 12 separate times. Each trader in that chain added a markup, and each markup compounded on top of the last. Some historians estimate the price of pepper increased by as much as 100-fold between the Indian coast where it was harvested and the European dinner table where it was finally sold. And here is the part that made this system so brilliant and honestly so cruel. The Arab traders who controlled the middle of this chain protected the true source of these spices like a state secret. They told European buyers elaborate, deliberately misleading stories about where cinnamon and pepper actually came from. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that cinnamon came from giant birds who used the sticks to build nests on cliffs no human could climb, and that traders had to leave large chunks of meat below the cliffs to lure the birds into overloading their nests until they collapsed to the ground. Another old story claimed cinnamon grew in a lake guarded by winged serpents that would attack anyone who tried to approach. None of this was remotely true, but it worked exactly as intended. As long as Europeans believed spices came from monster-guarded lakes and impossible cliffside nests, they had no reason to think they could simply sail there themselves and cut out the middlemen entirely. The mystery itself was the wall protecting the trade. This information monopoly lasted for centuries, and it made the merchant states controlling the western end of this route, especially Venice, spectacularly wealthy. By the late Middle Ages, Venice had essentially cornered the European spice trade, and the city's wealth, its palaces, its navy, its entire economic identity, was built substantially on pepper, cloves, and cinnamon flowing through its harbor. But every monopoly eventually invites competition, and by the 1400s, other European powers were growing tired of paying Venetian and Arab middlemen for a product whose true origin they could not even verify. That frustration is what eventually set the age of exploration into motion. But before we jump ahead a full century, it is worth pausing on just how deep Europe's spice obsession already ran, because it is easy to underestimate. Ancient Rome imported so much pepper that a specific warehouse district in the city, called the Horia Pipertaria, existed for the sole purpose of storing it. Roman cookbooks from the period, the most famous attributed to a gourmet named Apicius, call for pepper in an enormous share of their recipes, both sweet and savory. This was not a luxury reserved for rare feasts. For wealthy Romans, pepper was closer to a daily habit woven into ordinary meals. Rome's appetite for pepper was so well known across the ancient world that it shows up in one of the most dramatic moments of the empire's decline. In the year 408, the Visigothic king Alaric laid siege to the city of Rome itself. As part of the ransom, he demanded to spare the city from destruction. Alongside gold, silver, and fine silk, Alaric specifically demanded 3,000 pounds of pepper. Think about that for a moment. A so-called barbarian king surrounding the capital of the Roman Empire did not simply want gold. He wanted pepper too because he understood exactly how valuable it was considered. That is not the behavior of a culture treating pepper as a mere seasoning. That is the behavior of a culture treating pepper as a form of currency. This pattern, spices functioning almost like hard currency, shows up again and again throughout medieval Europe. Rents, dowries, and even taxes were sometimes paid directly in peppercorns rather than coin. The phrase peppercorn rent, still used today to describe a token or nominal payment, comes directly from this history, from a time when a single peppercorn could legally satisfy an entire contract. So by the time we arrive at the 1400s, we are not talking about a culture with a mild passing interest in seasoning. We are talking about roughly 1,000 years of European civilization treating certain spices as a genuine form of wealth. And that wealth was flowing steadily eastward, out of European hands, into the pockets of Arab and Venetian traders. Sooner or later, someone was going to try to change that. That someone turned out to be a small kingdom on the western edge of Europe, with no easy access to the Mediterranean spice routes at all, Portugal. In the early 1400s, Prince Henry, later nicknamed the Navigator, began funding voyage after voyage down the west coast of Africa. His motivations were tangled together in a way typical of the era: Christian expansion, the pursuit of gold, the horrific business of the slave trade, and increasingly, a dream of finding a sea route to Asia that would bypass the Arab and Venetian middlemen entirely and reach the source of the spice trade directly. For decades, Portuguese sailors crept further and further south along the African coastline, charting territory Europeans had never mapped before, hoping to eventually round the bottom of the continent and sail east into the Indian Ocean. It took nearly 70 years of slow, incremental progress. In 1488, a captain named Bartholomew Dias finally rounded the southern tip of Africa, a point he named the Cape of Storms. The Portuguese king quickly renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, understanding good marketing when he saw it. The true breakthrough came a decade later, under a captain named Vasco da Gama. In 1497, da Gama set sail with 4 ships and firm instructions to reach India directly by sea. The voyage was brutal. Scurvy killed a significant portion of his crew, and the fleet spent months entirely out of sight of land in open ocean, a genuinely terrifying prospect for sailors of that era who had never attempted anything like it. In May of 1498, da Gama's ships finally reached Calicut on India's Malabar coast, the literal source of the pepper that had been passing through a dozen different hands before it ever reached Europe. The local response was almost anticlimactic. Da Gama's cheap trade goods, the kind that had worked reasonably well for trading along the West African coast, were essentially laughed out of the market by Indian merchants accustomed to dealing in silk, silver, and fine-crafted goods. Da Gama's first voyage was, commercially speaking, something of a disappointment. But it did not matter. The message had already been sent. A European power could now sail directly to the true source of the spice trade, with no Arab or Venetian middleman required at any point. When da Gama returned home to Portugal, the spices he did manage to bring back were sold at a markup so enormous, some estimates suggest as much as 60 times the total cost of the voyage, that Portugal immediately understood the magnitude of what it had found. Portugal built an entire network of fortified trading posts along this new route, in places like Goa, Malacca, and eventually posts near the Spice Islands themselves, all backed by cannon and heavily armed warships. This was not gentle, polite trade. Portuguese fleets fought genuine naval battles against Arab, Indian, and later other European powers in order to enforce a monopoly on this new route, and they did so with considerable brutality. Within a single generation, Venice's centuries-old spice monopoly fell into serious decline. Portugal had cracked the secret that Arab traders had protected for centuries, and that success immediately set off a scramble among every other European power watching nervously from the sidelines. While Portugal was slowly inching down the African coastline, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus had a very different, and much riskier, idea of his own. Columbus believed, incorrectly, based on a serious underestimate of the Earth's actual circumference, that sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean would be a shorter route to Asia than going all the way around Africa. His goal was never to discover a new continent. There was no America anywhere in his plan. His goal was exactly the same as Portugal's goal: reach the spice-rich lands of Asia, specifically the East Indies and the court of the Chinese emperor, and bring home pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg without paying a single Arab or Venetian middleman along the way. For years, Columbus pitched this plan to Portugal, and Portugal turned him down. Their own navigators correctly calculated that the distance involved would be far greater than Columbus claimed. And besides, Portugal was already deeply committed to its African route. Eventually, Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, eager not to be left behind in this new race for direct access to Asian spices, agreed to fund his voyage instead. In October of 1492, Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean. He remained convinced for the rest of his life that he had reached islands somewhere near Asia, which is the entire reason the Caribbean is still sometimes called the West Indies today, and why the indigenous peoples he encountered there were mislabeled as Indians. He spent his voyages actively searching for the pepper, cinnamon, and gold he fully expected to find in these so-called Indies, and he reported finding local plants that he insisted were the very spices he had been searching for. They were not. He had found chili peppers, not black pepper. The two plants share a common name in English, but they are otherwise completely unrelated. Columbus never did get his spices, but the voyage he undertook specifically to reach the spice trade had, instead, placed an entire hemisphere onto the European map for the very first time. The search for a shortcut to nutmeg and cinnamon is, quite literally, the reason Europe learned the Americas existed at all. It is one of the great accidents of world history. Spain, having missed the direct route to the actual Spice Islands, would spend the following century extracting a different kind of wealth from the continent it had found instead, namely enormous quantities of silver and gold from Mexico and Peru. But the original prize, the true Spice Islands, would end up being fought over by two other rising powers entirely: the Dutch and the English. By the start of the 1600s, Portugal's monopoly on the direct spice route had begun to weaken considerably. Rival European powers had by now learned the route existed and were no longer willing to let a single country control it. Two new players entered the contest with a genuinely new kind of institution behind them: the joint stock trading company. The English East India Company was founded in 1600. The Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials as the VOC, followed close behind in 1602. These were not merely trading businesses in the ordinary sense. They possessed their own private armies, their own navies, and full legal authority from their home governments to wage war, sign treaties, and govern conquered territory. They were, in effect, corporations wielding the powers of nation-states. The prize both companies wanted most of all was control of the Banda Islands, the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew, and the nearby Moluccas, the source of cloves. The Dutch moved first, and they moved with considerable force. Under a VOC governor named Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, the Dutch decided that the most reliable way to control the nutmeg trade was not to negotiate patiently with the local Bandanese people, but to eliminate the competition entirely. In 1621, Cohen led a campaign against the Bandanese population that resulted in the deaths of the overwhelming majority of the island's inhabitants. Historical estimates suggest that around 15,000 people, out of a total population somewhere in that same range, were killed, starved, enslaved, or forced into exile. The Dutch then repopulate the islands using enslaved laborers and Dutch plantation overseers to run the nutmeg groves under direct company control. This is the part of spice history that rarely makes it into a cheerful food documentary, but it is essential to understanding what a monopoly actually meant in this era. Controlling the nutmeg supply was not achieved through clever negotiation or a favorable trade deal. It was achieved through one of the most brutal colonial massacres of the period, engineered by a company whose primary and overriding goal was profit for its shareholders back home in Amsterdam. With the Bandanese population largely destroyed, the VOC had achieved exactly what it wanted: near total control of the world's entire nutmeg supply, alongside enormous influence over the clove trade in the nearby Moluccas. To keep prices artificially high, the Dutch reportedly went so far as to burn excess nutmeg harvests, and according to some historical accounts, treated nutmeg seeds with lime specifically so they could never be successfully planted anywhere else. This was an early and brutal form of protecting a monopoly through deliberate scarcity. But one small island within the Banda Group held out against total Dutch control. Run Island remained under English control, defended by a small East India Company outpost, for several decades, becoming a persistent thorn in the side of the Dutch monopoly. As long as the English held even one nutmeg-producing island, they retained a genuine toehold in the trade and a legitimate claim to keep pressing for more. This standoff simmered for most of the century, tangled up with broader Anglo-Dutch conflicts happening simultaneously across Europe and in the colonies both powers held across the Atlantic. Which brings us back to the deal that closes the loop on where we began. By the 1660s, the English and the Dutch were fighting each other on multiple fronts at once: in Europe, along the coast of West Africa, and in North America, where the English had recently seized the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, a small trading settlement on the island of Manhattan, and promptly renamed it New York. When the Second Anglo-Dutch War finally ended in 1667 with the Treaty of Breda, the two powers had to formally settle who kept what. The Dutch had, by this point, captured Run Island from the English. The English, meanwhile, held on to New Amsterdam. The treaty formalized this outcome. The Dutch kept Run Island, and with it, sole control of the world's entire nutmeg supply. The English kept Manhattan. At the time, this looked like an obviously good deal for the Dutch. Nutmeg was a proven, wildly profitable commodity that had already made the VOC one of the richest companies in world history. New Amsterdam, by comparison, was a small, unglamorous fur-trading outpost home to a few thousand residents at most. Historians today generally push back on the oversimplified version of this story. The swap was not a single tidy one-for-one trade negotiated over a single afternoon, and both powers had a range of other strategic reasons behind the broader treaty's terms. But the core fact holds up regardless. The Dutch prioritized keeping a nutmeg-producing island over keeping Manhattan, because in 1667, a small tropical island producing the entire world's nutmeg supply genuinely looked like the far better asset to hold on to. Nutmeg's monopoly value, however, did not last forever. Nutmeg trees were eventually smuggled out of the Banda Islands and successfully planted elsewhere, notably on islands throughout the Caribbean, including Grenada, which today produces a significant share of the entire world's nutmeg supply. Once the monopoly finally broke, prices fell steadily, and nutmeg gradually became the ordinary, everyday spice we recognize today, no longer considered valuable enough to fight wars over. Manhattan, meanwhile, became Manhattan. Step back from all of this, and the pattern running through this entire story becomes remarkable. A handful of dried seeds, bark, and dried flower buds, things that add flavor to food but provide essentially no nutritional value on their own, drove some of the most consequential events in world history. The desire for direct access to pepper pushed Portugal to pioneer an entirely new sea route around the continent of Africa, opening the very first direct maritime link between Europe and Asia. That same search for a spice shortcut sent Columbus sailing across the Atlantic and placed the Americas onto the European map for the first time, setting in motion centuries of colonization that followed. And the fight to control nutmeg and cloves specifically produced some of the most brutal corporate colonial violence in recorded history, along with the very trading companies, the VOC and the East India Company, that would go on to become the templates for the modern multinational corporation as we understand it today. Even the smaller details of this story echo forward into the present. Peppercorn rent remains legal terminology used in contracts today. The profits generated by the spice trade helped finance the beginnings of modern capital markets. Since the VOC is often cited by historians as having issued the very first modern tradable stock in history, and the underlying idea of a company powerful enough to maintain its own army, negotiate binding treaties, and reshape entire regions of the world for the sake of a single commodity, that idea begins here with cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg. Today, you can walk into any ordinary grocery store and buy all 4 of these spices for just a few dollars total. It is worth remembering, the next time you reach for a jar of cinnamon or grind fresh pepper onto your dinner, that you are holding something people once burned cities for, waged naval wars over, and traded away Manhattan itself in order to control. That is the secret history of spices. War, wealth, and world discovery, one peppercorn at a time.